Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. While I normally can be found at the Atlantic Council headquarters in Washington, I'm coming to you from Warsaw to host this event. We have a wonderful event on developments in the South Caucasus, movement towards peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and we have an excellent, diverse group to discuss this for you. We have Brian Ardouni, who's the executive director of the Armenian Assembly of America. We have Luke Coffey, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. We have Ambassador John Heffron, who's a distinguished fellow at Georgetown University and a former U.S. ambassador to Armenia. We have Dr. Izmira Jafarova, who's a board member at the Center of Analysis of International Relations. And we have Ambassador James Warlick, who's the president of Juno Global Strategies and the former co-chair of the OSCE Minsk Group on the South Caucasus. So I will start with questions for our group. I am reminded to tell the audience that they can ask questions to the group after I provide my questions at askac.org. So we'll start with Ambassador Warlick, again, who had headed the OSCE process on the South Caucasus on negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So, Ambassador Warlick, Armenia and Azerbaijan's negotiations have been continuing with relative success, despite some sticking points that seem to crop up periodically as the sides work through disagreements. How would you assess the negotiations and the prospects for a real sustainable peace?
Thank you for having me on the panel. Well, this is a favorite parlor game, deciding when peace will actually take place and agreement will be signed. It does appear that we're coming close, but it's very difficult to know. We've seen this movie many times before. Other times we've come close, but have been unable to cross the finish line. There are several key issues that that the negotiations are focused on. The first, the enclaves, seems to be a resolved issue, although it's not entirely clear. Prime Minister Pashinyan made a very compelling move to turn over the 4 enclaves that were under discussion. The other issues are very difficult. Demarcation would seem simple since the parties have agreed to look to the Soviet map as a starting point for the borders, but this is going to take a long time beyond the scope of this framework agreement, but we hope that they can find language. The third and more difficult issue is our transportation issues, and in particular, a corridor between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan. And we can talk about that further, but I think it is in both countries' interest, not just to resolve it, but to find a way to create a corridor. And the Azerbaijanis seem to would be willing to live with a rail corridor and welcome that. And frankly, Armenia should welcome such a border, which could open up borders and lead to further trade and communications. It's difficult, but I do think it's possible to find an agreement, and hopefully the parties are getting close.
Okay, was there any other issue? I thought you said there were 4.
Well, we can always add issues. I wanted to start with those 3.
Okay, so my apologies. Okay, Dr. Jafarova, the same question to you. How do you and the government in Baku think negotiations are going? What are the prospects?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me. Well, I want to join the optimism expressed by Ambassador Warlick about how the things evolving at the moment. And I believe that, and also the view from Azerbaijan is that there is a unique opportunity for rapprochement at the moment between the parties that has not really existed before. But I also tend to agree with Ambassador Warlick that we have seen this movie many times. However, the conditions here are slightly different because there are real progress that have been made on the couple of cluster of issues, and I want to highlight those issues if you allow me. First issue, it would be the political will and the political process that is happening between the parties. It's for the first time since like many years. Last December, 7th of December in 2023, there were an agreement signed between the parties that was forged bilaterally, and they made an announcement that they are ready to move forward with the peace process, and that there is a historic chance to achieve a peace treaty between the Armenia and Azerbaijan. And Armenia supported Azerbaijan's candidature for COP29, for hosting COP29, in response to Azerbaijan supporting Armenia's candidacy in the Eastern European Bureau of the COP Bureau membership. And then there was also the progress that was made in the demarcation and delimitation process, which is very important, because since May 24th, 2022, when the first meeting of the Demarcation and Delimitation Commission started, there have been 8 to 9 meetings that were held between the parties, but there wasn't really much success in that regard. But most of the success came after the meeting happened in April 19th and May 15th. And on April 19th, after the 8th meeting of the Delimitation Commission, Armenian side agreed to hand over 4 villages of Kazakh district to Azerbaijan peacefully. And some observers, I mean, not without any reasons, marked these as the first case where the lingering conflict between the two sides was really solved by peaceful means. I mean, of course, it generated different reactions within Armenia. We have seen protests and demonstrations happening after that, but that was really huge progress that happened between the two parties in the peace track. And the matter also is that there is also some border pillars that have been established between Armenia and Azerbaijan. About a dozen border pillars have been established between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Kazakh district of Azerbaijan and Tavush district of Armenia, as well as they have defined the northernmost area between Armenia and Azerbaijan of the border delimitation process. So you see, slowly but surely, there is some progress in that regard, which actually shows that there is progress. And Armenian Prime Minister also acknowledged this border delimitation and establishment of border pillars as security guarantees, something like that, because obviously it's something that provides confidence building and security between the two parties, and the hope that things can really move forward in a positive way. Another issue that I want to highlight is about the maps that was also mentioned previously. Previously, the two parties didn't see eye to eye about which kind of maps they should use for delimitation process. Armenia was supporting mostly 1975 map, and Azerbaijan was saying, well, no, we should look at most of the maps, all of the maps that have legal force, that were in force during the Soviet time. However, again, they were talking around the bush and not really doing much about that. But I think there was also some sort of agreement and understanding in that regard, with Armenian Prime Minister also saying that the delimitation process, I think he said in May, somewhere 7th of May, there was a statement that was made on behalf of him, or he said it at some of the meetings, that we should look at most of the maps, not really one map. So all of the maps that actually have legal force, something like that, which shows that there is some sort of really understanding that not only one single map should be taken for delimitation process. And also, as a result of the Delimitation and Demarcation Commission meeting in April 19th, there was a statement that was put out by the parties, which showed that the delimitation and demarcation process should be carried out based on the Almaty Declaration of 1991, which does not specifically focus on any sort of map. So therefore, I believe this is also a progress that should be highlighted. And the last but not least, I think this is very remarkable that the meetings between Armenia and Azerbaijan is happening on a bilateral basis without third-party mediation, third-party facilitation. And meeting in Almaty was another manifestation of the fact that the two parties can actually talk to each other bilaterally, because Almaty was just a venue, you know, there's the forum where they just met and spoke. Kazakhstan wasn't really mediating the meeting between the parties. So I think this is, on political level, very, very important development, that the two parties are actually talking to each other on bilateral basis, and I believe there is hope for it. But the last point I want to make, maybe we'll talk about it the next round, but I want to mention it. Maybe I won't have chance. We believe that there is a hope for peace agreement this year. Maybe not as quickly as we would like it to happen, but Azerbaijani side expected a hope that there may be some sort of agreement based on basic principles, some fundamental principles of the peace treaty, of peace agreement, generic agreement, maybe before the end of the year, before the COP29. And then at the later stage, there could be worked on more comprehensive aspects of the peace treaty, because it's going to take time. So there is an approach to detach the peace agreement, basic principles, and the more comprehensive peace treaty that can be signed at a later stage, because there are challenges also remaining. And I would like to speak about the challenges maybe at the next round, if you allow me.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you just a quick question. And despite your comprehensive answer, because of Ambassador Warlick made the point about on the transportation issue of a rail corridor as a solution. Quickly, what do you think of that?
You see, transportation is issue. We call it Lain Corridor, and there are some other names for it. It's still remaining as a bone of contention between the parties, because Azerbaijani side has already fulfilled its portion of Horadiz-Ağband highway roads. There will be also a railway there. The most of the work is already done, but Armenia hasn't really started anything to do with that. And the thing is, it was also an obligation that was taken by Armenia side in the 2020 November agreement, that there will be this linkage linking Armenia and Azerbaijan with Nakhchivan, and Armenia has to provide this linkage. But now we have been seeing lots of controversy around it, lots of playing around. But I believe that once there was this obligation to provide this link between Armenia and Nakhchivan, Armenia had to abide by its commitment. But there's a problem. They consider the problem about who's going to provide security guarantees, because the 2020 agreement says that Russian border guard had to provide the security guarantees. But the Armenian side talks about some sort of international mechanism. And I think there isn't really much agreement about who is going to provide security guarantees. And Azerbaijani side says, okay, fine, but you have signed this agreement saying that Russian border guards should provide the security guarantees. But I believe there is still much room to maneuver about that, and we're going to see much talk about it. But again, Armenian side has to come to terms with the fact that they have taken this obligation to provide this corridor, which they are not happy to go along with. The matter of customs also remaining as a, let's say, bone of contention in that regard, who is going to provide what kind of regimes they're going to be. So there are open issues. Again, I would like to speak more, but in the next round.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Arduni, also your view on the negotiations and prospects for peace.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for having me today. Very much appreciate the opportunity. Let me just pick up just briefly on the corridor. I don't know if we'll get into it more, but look, the November 2020 trilateral agreement that was signed by Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia had a host of different issues, including keeping the Lain Corridor open, which was an obligation by Azerbaijan, which the U.S. International courts urged Azerbaijan to keep open, as opposed to blockading under false pretenses and basically starving the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. In terms of the corridor, and I was just recently in Armenia, and I have the doesn't matter, but the Crossroads of Peace initiative, where the Armenian government lays out these transportation connections, links, with a fundamental principle that's different than Azerbaijan or Russia. Armenia is saying, yes, let's have transportation links, but in terms of the infrastructure, it will be controlled by each country within its sovereign territory. So the Armenian government is saying, we're not going to have an extraterritorial corridor running through our country. I don't think any country would agree to such an action. And I know there's this Thursday there's a presidential debate. Everyone's looking forward to it, I'm sure. But I would imagine that even Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden would agree on this one, that you're not going to have an extraterritorial corridor going through your country. But let me just pick up overall on the peace process. My takeaway from, and I was just there 2 weeks ago, my takeaway from meetings with the Armenian government is that they are committed to this peace process. But we, the Armenian Assembly, we do have deep concerns about Azerbaijan's commitment based on a long track record of warmongering and empty promises. And including, and let me just highlight we talked about the November 2020 agreement. Part of that agreement was to release all the prisoners. Azerbaijan has actually taken more prisoners since, including many of the Artsakh leaders who represented freedom, liberty, and democracy. They remain in prison today with little communication with their families, some facing torture, and none with access to due process of law. This group included former presidents, foreign ministers, the former state minister, Ruben Vardanyan, who is one of the most recognized leaders in the global Armenian community, and he was actively involved in various economic and humanitarian projects in Armenia and Artsakh, actually some 700 projects. In April of this year, in protest of his illegal incarceration, he started a 21-day hunger strike. No one really knew about it in April, but we found out later. In response, Azerbaijan, according to his legal team, kept Mr. Vardanyan standing for hours, did not let him sleep, deprived him of water. And so there's been a formal complaint of torture filed with the UN Special Rapporteur of Torture just a few weeks ago. I mean, it's really hard to imagine having a true peace with Azerbaijan when it continues to hold political prisoners, I mean, hostages essentially. And it should be noted that the EU, members of Congress, including recently Senator Markey and the French Senate, have all called for a peace deal that includes the release of these prisoners. And I know our time is limited, so I'm not going to get into it all, but look, the State Department came out with their human rights report on Azerbaijan, and it highlighted a litany of significant human rights issues in Azerbaijan. And let me just, I'm not going to get into all of it, but essentially, the report talks about unlawful and arbitrary killing, torture and cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment by members of the security forces, sometimes life-threatening prison conditions, arbitrary detention, serious problems with independence of judiciary, political prisoners and detainees, serious abuses in a conflict, including deliberate deprivation of items required by civilian population and denial of humanitarian access, serious restrictions of freedom of expression and media, and it goes on. So look, this is the State Department human rights report saying this. And so we remain deeply troubled, and we continue to urge the release of all the Armenian prisoners. And I'm sure we can pick up more on these issues.
Okay, Dr. Jafarova, if you want to have a 2-minute chance to comment on this, you can give it to you, or you can use the top of your next intervention to address that. Your call.
If I could just say 2 minutes, I thought this conversation would be mostly about peace process, but I am gathering that we are going to a completely different direction. But I want to say briefly that Azerbaijan has released over 200 prisoners of war and detainees of Armenian origin after this 2020 war. And those that are currently detained are the criminals that are charged by the criminal activity under Azerbaijani constitution, including Vardanyan, who is a criminal who has been in a search list in Interpol, and he is financing terrorism. He has been organizing illegal activities within internationally recognized territories of Azerbaijan. So he has been charged with criminal charges, and therefore he is detained. As to the conditions of his detention, well, Azerbaijan assures that all the conditions have been provided for their normal survival, of course, normal detention. And it has been, by the way, rechecked by International Red Cross, by the way, today as well, to testify to the fact that their preservation conditions are normal and actually according to international standards. So I don't want to go into details about, all these accusations, but briefly, this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
We'll agree to disagree.
Okay.
Of course, I disagree too, so.
Okay. Ambassador Heffron, Armenia recently announced it will withdraw soon from the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. And at roughly the same time, it said it aimed to upgrade its relations with the U.S. to a strategic partnership. What are the implications of this diplomatic shift for Armenia and for the South Caucasus?
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody, and pleasure to join this panel on this timely topic. Let me just, I'll incorporate the response to that, John, in a very, very brief two basic points on developments in Armenia. Since I left in 2014, so much has happened. It's really quite amazing. I guess they cut out the dead wood at the embassy, and now there's lots of improvements since then, mostly improvements. But no, two basic things are happening in Armenia that I think we need to consider, and I hope it's important to everybody on this panel. First is on the internal side. Pashinyan elected pretty much free and fair 2018. Then the horrors of 2020 and the defeat, military defeat, and then he gets reelected in 2021. That's quite amazing that a democratically elected leader in a newly democratizing country is able to withstand a military defeat and get reelected in the next election. And that does demonstrate to me, at least looking at it from afar, that the Armenian people really are committed to this democratic road that they're on now. So that's my first sort of internal point. On the external side, and this is the key point that you just raised, my goal when I was there, and all U.S. ambassadors' goals when they're there, are to have Armenia lean west. And the idea was lean west. We weren't even thinking that they were going to turn away from Moscow and leave the CSTO and really try to focus on Brussels and Washington and Western capitals. So that's a hugely positive development that Pashinyan has taken this tough decision to move away from Moscow and to leave the CSTO. They're Armenia is obviously in a very dangerous neighborhood, and to not have a security guarantor didn't help them much in the last two wars. I got that, but to not have to cut yourself off from your security guarantor is a bold thing to do. And so I do think that we in the West, I'm not saying reward him, but we need to see Armenia as a partner on the democracy side and on the regional stability side, and do whatever we can, the U.S. and the EU, to continue to support them and to continue to push them in this direction. And I hope that on the private sector side, the NGO side, groups like Armenia Assembly and other groups, and U.S. government and the EU will continue to support Armenia and continue to push them in this direction that they're on now. So very positive development to leave the CSTO and turn away from Moscow. And now we need to continue to respond to that, we in the West, to demonstrate to the Armenian people that it's worth their while to look west.
Thank you, Ambassador Heffron. Luke Coffey, with all you're an outstanding voice on Russian policy across Eurasia, with all the changing dynamics in the region, most of which are positive, Russia's still a looming presence in the South Caucasus. How would you describe Moscow's goals vis-a-vis Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Thanks, John, and thanks to your colleagues at the Atlantic Council for putting this together and inviting me to participate. I share most of the optimism that I heard. It wasn't all optimistic, but I shared the optimism that was there. I certainly share, and I think we have a great opportunity to usher in an era of stability and even prosperity to the South Caucasus. But Russia's not going to like this. Russia sees this region as being in a sphere of influence. It uses these frozen conflicts, whether it was Ashken Valley region in Abkhazia in Georgia, or the occupied regions of Azerbaijan, Karabakh, and the 7 surrounding districts, to maximize its influence in the region. And if you take an example, let's say between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where there is a glimmer of hope, where the countries are on the route to normalizing, where they can behave like neighbors and cooperate and even integrate regional transport structures and and other forms of economic investment. This is a threat to Russia's influence in the region. And even though Pashinyan has been so brave as an Armenian leader and politician, when the chips are down, the Kremlin is not going to let him get off this easily. And I suspect that there's going to be a very rocky road ahead inside Armenia, inside the domestic politics of Armenia. But the United States should be doing everything we can to encourage not only Armenia and Azerbaijan normalization, but also Turkey and Armenian normalization. Get everyone together, get around the peace table, hammer this out, because it only benefits the people in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Think about the billions of dollars in foreign direct investment that have been denied to the region over the years because of this ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. If you can solve this and then get Turkey involved, the economic potential, the transport potential, all of this is great. And at a time when the United States is trying to work with our European partners to find transport corridor and energy alternatives to Russia to the north or Iran to the south, this region, the South Caucasus, becomes even more important. So I would argue, John, in conclusion here, that because of Russia's difficulties in Ukraine, its influence is waning in the South Caucasus. It's not going to fall off a cliff, but it's certainly heading in a downward trajectory. And this offers opportunities for the U.S., our European partners, and the countries in the region, especially Armenia and Azerbaijan.
That was great. Let me ask you a quick follow-up question. You're right. Putin's run into great problems in Ukraine, and hopefully it'll get greater. But what if he were to find 2,000 or 3,000 troops he would send Armenia's way in order to impose his will? Do you think that's a real, because we see the Kremlin fulminating against Pashinyan. Do you think that's a real possibility or just a highly unlikely scenario?
Well, we shouldn't forget that, with all the positive talk and the positive recent developments resulting from the statements coming from Armenia about jettisoning the CSTO, looking more to the west, we shouldn't forget that as we sit here today speaking, Russia is still the security guarantor of Armenia. It still has several thousand soldiers inside Armenia. It still controls most of the international borders of Armenia. Armenia's airspace is integrated into the airspace of the Russian Federation in terms of its monitoring, security, and control. So I don't think it would be a matter of Russia having to send even more troops into Armenia. They already have a sizable amount there. But I think many of the Russian threats that could be directed at Armenia and at Pashinyan in particular will be of a hybrid nature. That's my prediction.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ambassador Warlick. Jim, you're a former U.S. co-chair of the OSCE Minsk Group. What role do you see for the U.S. in current negotiations and in the South Caucasus? And before you answer, just let me say, I've been known to criticize the administration on policy towards Russia and Ukraine, but I think that both Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken have been very, very positive forces in the negotiation process.
Well, Luke gave some very compelling reasons why the United States should care about the South Caucasus, and I agree with all of them. It is encouraging. We just saw Assistant Secretary Brian O'Brien in the region. An important telephone call took place between our Secretary of State and President Aliyev, and presumably he pushed very hard for a peace treaty. U.S. engagement is vitally important, but honestly, we have a lot going on domestically as well as internationally, and it's unclear to the extent that we are willing to be engaged in the future. I'd also add that these issues are extremely complicated. I do think that we can be an honest broker on many of them. I think that the European Union, European Council, others are unacceptable mediators between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But there may come a time when we want to be more actively engaged on issues that they can't solve bilaterally. So it is important. In addition to all that the United States has on its plate, we honestly, at a senior level, do not have a deep bench on the South Caucasus. And are our senior policymakers prepared to be
My apologies to the audience. We seem to have had a slight technical problem. But I'm glad to see that at least I'm back on board. Waiting for the others to also appear. Aha, good. So, Jim, I think you were speaking.
Right. I was saying that the United States has a lot of issues on its plate, and domestically and internationally. And there's a question of to what extent we can be effective mediators at this time as difficult issues come up. I'm also pleased to see that there's a congressional delegation, and a large one, headed out to Armenia. So to the extent that the legislative branch can also stay involved, that will be an important factor in, I hope, working positively through the issues that will come up.
Thank you. Dr. Jafarova, you've already described, I think, in some detail, the current issues that remain. So just a bottom line assessment. All of it seems like the question of territory has been resolved, at least in principle. You talked about trying to have an agreement in principle by the end of this year. What would need to be done to get that agreement in principle by the end of this year, within the follow-up peace treaty next year?
Well, I mentioned that there are prospects which are looking up, but there are also challenges, and we have to speak about them. And one of the first challenges is that there is a constitutional issue in regard to Armenia's constitution, because the constitution of Armenian Republic contains territorial claim against Azerbaijan, and it recognizes Karabakh as part of Armenia. And Azerbaijan says that, okay, if we're going to sign this peace treaty, then there is a necessity for Armenia to change the constitution, at least the clause that is containing territorial claims against Azerbaijan. Because what's the guarantee that we sign the peace treaty with Armenia, and the next day Armenia's constitutional court overrules the treaty saying that it's against the constitution, because, in the constitution there is a claim towards Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan says that, well, constitutional reform is important in order to drop territorial claims against Azerbaijan, but we understand this is not easy. although Armenia's prime minister also said himself in January this year that constitutional reform seems to be inevitable, but there isn't any unity in Armenian society about that. And we have seen the protests after the handover of the villages to Azerbaijan, and we have seen that things are not really smoothly going on within Armenian society in this regard. So it may take some time. However, it's absolutely necessary that Armenia drops its constitutional demand against Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, and also because there is international best practices in international history. We have seen the cases when if the constitution contains a claim against territory of a certain state, they drop it and then they sign a peace treaty. We have seen the Good Friday Agreement, for example. It was not maybe identical conflict case, but still there was also the clause was the constitution when Ireland dropped the constitutional demand towards North Ireland, and after that there was a peace treaty signed. So we have seen that there is also international best practices which could be utilized in that regard. So this is number one challenge. And another one we spoke is the opening of all the communications and Gazur corridor. And I listened very carefully to Mr. Ardouni, who said that the Gazur corridor, it just contains some sort of giving extraterritoriality to a certain state, and it's kind of ceding the portion of Armenia's territory, which is absolutely not the case. And we have been saying it again and again everywhere on each and every platform that the usage of the word of corridor is simply the matter of semantics. You can name it road, you can name it whatever you want, but it will not really change the substance of the fact that that has been agreed upon by the November 20 declaration that Armenia has to provide this unimpeded, it says unimpeded passage, which again means that it shouldn't be really prevented by any kind of conditions. Although we understand that there may be customs regulations, there may be security guarantees that have to be provided. And I spoke a little bit about security matters and customs issues. They can also be agreed upon at a later stage if they would be, of course, a necessity. And that, I mean, not the necessity, but if it's absolutely necessary. But the idea is that it's not the matter of giving Armenia's territory to anyone. It's the matter of abiding by the commitments that has been enshrined by the November Declaration. And I want to also speak about this. This is two of the challenges I mentioned. Another challenge is Armenia receiving lots of arms and ammunitions from the third parties. And we have seen this happening very, very intensely over the period of last month and last years, specifically from France and India, and mostly from France. And I have also read the statement by the US side who said that France's policy is not really contributing to the peace and security in the South Caucasus. They have been in agreements on defense and security, on military training, on the purchase of artillery systems, surveillance system from France, as well as the agreement about, as I said, trainings and mutual visits and military expertise as well. So the question naturally rising from Azerbaijani side, against whom France is arming Armenia, against whom this military armaments is being accumulated. So it actually creates the image where South Caucasus is becoming another area for arms race instead of focusing mostly on the peace process and signing the peace treaty. So those are three issues I wanted to highlight, mostly about the challenges. I'm sure there will be many. If we have more time, I can speak about them. But if you allow me also 2 minutes, I want to reflect on the two issues that were raised by Mr. Ardouni. He said that Lain Corridor, Azerbaijan blocked Lain Corridor under false pretenses. May I remind you that Azerbaijan spoke about Lain Corridor being used for military purposes by the Armenian proper in order to arm its militias remaining in Azerbaijani territories for many years, over a couple of years after the 2020 war, and it all went unheeded. And at the end of the day, after suffering several attacks and after suffering several terrorist attacks against its soldiers, against its territories, Azerbaijan had to embark on anti-terrorist activity in last year in September. So it wasn't any pretext. It's not like Lain Corridor was used only for civilian purposes. It was heavily used for military purposes, and Azerbaijan did what it had to do for protecting its national security. Another issue about and starving the people, again, I can speak for hours about it, but briefly, Azerbaijan sent warnings to to all Karabakh Armenians living in Karabakh when the military operation happened, that they are being kept safe, and that they have the right to become the citizens of Azerbaijan. No one really forced them to leave. If you follow the news outlets and everything that happened at that time, you can see that there were lots of testaments that these people were leaving at the gunshot of the separatists who were telling them they have to leave because they will be, I don't know, tortured or whatever will happen to them after Azerbaijanis came. So most of them didn't want to leave. They left under duress, and this has been documented in the many outlets. So please, let's be careful about using this terminology. And Crossroads of Peace initiative that you mentioned, well, we are open. Azerbaijan side says that, okay, we are open to any sorts of initiatives. This sounds as a good initiative, why not? But the thing is, it's actually looking much more declaratory than really bringing in any kind of substance to the actual situation on the ground. In order to make this Crossroads of Peace initiative to work, Armenia has to have good relations with Turkey, has to have good relations with Azerbaijan, because if you look towards the east, it is Azerbaijan. If you look towards the west, it is Turkey. So you have to open all the communications, you have to normalize the relations. Any way you slice it, you just have to do this. And the Crossroads of Peace doesn't really bring any added value to the already existing mechanisms that have to be put in place. The shortest passage is the Lain Corridor. So that I also wanted to highlight. Thank you very much for tolerating me speaking for so long.
Dr. Zafarov's last comment anticipates my question. I was going to ask you, how does the Armenia's Crossroad for Peace fit into connectivity in the South Caucasus and also between Europe and Central Asia? But I imagine you'll also want to respond to some other comments, so please.
It seems like perhaps the two of us should have our own separate Zoom call and go through these issues. Look, briefly, in terms of the Azerbaijani demands about Armenia changing its constitution based on the Declaration of Independence that they put forward back in 1990. It was talking about Soviet Armenia at that time. So maybe everyone should go back and read the Declaration of Independence that Armenia put forward back in 1990. That's number one, in terms of sort of Azerbaijan continuing to change the goalposts. Or, now we have to have this corridor. If you look at the November 2020 agreement, the Article 9 says all economic and transport links in the region shall be unblocked, and that Armenia shall guarantee the safety and transport communications. It's sort of a non-issue now, given the multiple violations of the overall agreement, again, including the blockade of the Lain Corridor. And I just want to remind everybody, back in September of 2023, September 14th, there was a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Nagorno-Karabakh, and Yuri Kim stated very clearly that the United States will not countenance any action or effort to ethnically cleanse or commit other atrocities against the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, and further stated that the current humanitarian situation, meaning the blockade of the Lain Corridor, is not acceptable. And just days later, in blatant disregard to this public warning by the United States, Azerbaijan launched another military offensive, driving out 100,000 plus Armenians from their indigenous homeland. I mean, this is a clear example of ethnic cleansing. It was condemned by the European Parliament, and the Lemkin Institute and others have stated that what happened was a genocide. So imagine losing everything, and now we're talking about they could have stayed. Clearly not the case. Why would they all flee to Armenia? And look, these refugees are genocide survivors, and it's incumbent upon us to do everything that we can to help them, including the right of return. Now you talked about the Crossroads initiative. Look, I mean, again, we have other speakers and there's other questions coming, but look, this demonstrates Armenia's commitment to a path forward, and it also shows how Armenia can be a hub for transportation and regional links. So I think it's very important in terms of what Armenia is trying to put forward, and we can see that between whether it's the dictatorship of Azerbaijan or Turkey, they're not met with receptivity. So this is a challenge for the United States to really lean in more and do what we can to help the Armenian people.
Okay, thank you. We have only 14 minutes left, and I have to go 2 more questions for our panelists, so let's try and quickly get through them. Ambassador Heffron, this follows up on what Mr. Arduni just said. How can the U.S. best support infrastructure and connectivity projects in the South Caucasus?
Just let me just jump in real quick in response to a couple of many of the points that have been made. I would say that the key to this is that we deal with these issues in a regional context. And what I like the reference to Turkey, I like the references to the other neighbors. Bilaterally, I think it's just hard. It's just darn hard. And I'm not saying you ignore the bilateral. Obviously, you can. But I really think that we should be pushing, the U.S. should be pushing these issues, the transportation issues, the corridor, and the other closed borders all around into a regional context, especially, for example, Turkey. I mean, there's the earthquake in Turkey in 2023. Armenia pours aid across the border. The border is temporarily opened to receive all this aid from the Armenian people and the diaspora and the Armenian government. And then what does Ankara do? They close the border. I mean, so they get all the aid. It comes in one direction from Armenia down into Turkey, and then they close the border. Are you kidding me? I mean, what kind of approach is that? It's appalling. And I do think we, the U.S., should push the neighbors to get these issues dealt with in a regional way. The borders, the corridors. Zagazor should be related to the other corridor issues and the other border issues. There are all sorts of border issues. So I think package deals, confidence building measures are the way that we need to go step by step on a regional basis, rather than, I think, bilateral is very, very hard. So that's my basic recommendation, is that we, the U.S., push the parties into some kind of a regional format of some sort, get them all talking to each other. And hopefully all finding ways to make it win-win situations in terms of opening borders, trade, investment, and to support each other in this difficult neighborhood.
Thank you. Luke, I was going to ask you a different question relating to Azerbaijan's relations with Iran and Israel, but maybe it's more sense for you to comment on what's just been said by the previous 3 speakers. Your call.
Thanks, John. Actually, there's sort of a connection here. But firstly, when you discuss Azerbaijan and Iranian relations, you have to discuss the Zangezur corridor. And since this has been like a common thread throughout all of the interventions, I do want to address at least 30 seconds on this. Brian gave a very selective, minimal quote from Article 9, and it's actually quite brief. Article 9 of the agreement says all economic and transport connections in the region shall be unblocked. The Republic of Armenia shall guarantee the security of transport connections between the western regions of Republic of Azerbaijan and the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic in order to arrange the unobstructed movement of persons, vehicles, and cargo in both directions. Now, that's pretty clear. That there was an obligation on the behalf of the Armenians to open up this corridor. I never heard any Azerbaijani make a territorial claim or suggest it should be extraterritorial. They wanted a free movement, as perhaps as Americans would drive to Alaska going through Canada, right? That's what they wanted. But this is important to Azerbaijan's relations with Iran, because on the surface, the relationship between Baku and Tehran seems very cordial. The 2 neighbors trying in a difficult neighborhood, trying to be pragmatic and get along where they can. But I can tell you, under the surface in this relationship, it's a lot more complex. And the reason why the Azerbaijanis want to have this transit corridor linking Armenia with Nakhchivan is because right now it's reliant on Iranian territory, Iranian airspace to get supplies, basic supplies, like stuff you would find in a grocery store or in a market. They rely on Iran to get these goods into Nakhchivan. They also rely on Iran to have natural gas as part of a swap deal with Turkmenistan to provide natural gas to Nakhchivan. Now, what the Azerbaijanis are doing about this right now, they are working with Turkey to build a natural gas interconnector that will connect from Turkey into Nakhchivan. They have a very small, about 5-mile wide border with Turkey. That will solve the natural gas issue when this comes online, but they still have that big issue about ground transport and air transport having to go through Iran. And if you look at the history of Iran and Azerbaijan, it is one that is fraught with sectarian divisions, geopolitical difficulties. You had the Iranians, in the first Karabakh War in the early 90s, arming Armenia. You had Russian resupplies to Armenia transiting Iranian territory during the second Karabakh War into Armenia. And then you have the ethnic component. You have, millions of ethnic Azeris that live in northern Iran who could actually see cheering the Azerbaijani troops as they were advancing along the Aras River, waving Azerbaijani flags at soccer matches. They chant Azerbaijani soccer chants. So it's a very complex relationship between the two. And I have no doubt that Baku wants to have a cordial relationship with Tehran, but they don't want to be reliant or dependent on the Iranians when it comes to Nakhchivan.
And unmuted. Remind the audience you can submit questions at askac.org. All right. We have a question from Rob Schultz. President Pashinyan has so far refused Azerbaijan's proposals to change the Armenian constitution to get rid of what Baku calls territorial claims on Azerbaijani and Turkish land. Azerbaijan says this is a precondition for a peace deal. What do you think of this? I realize everyone would probably want to say something. Let me offer this to Ambassador Warlick.
Well, it shouldn't be a precondition for the signature of a framework agreement that brings about peace. At some point in the future, yes, the Constitution needs to be changed, but as I think everyone knows, that's not an easy proposition in Armenia. I think it's a deal breaker if the framework agreement rests upon the idea that the Constitution needs to be changed, because it's just not going to happen for many reasons. So this could be something that could be addressed in the framework agreement, that there is an intention and that the principle of changing the Constitution is an issue that could take place in the future, but the idea of amending it is not realistic.
Okay, thank you. Question here. Actually, an anonymous question for Dr. Jafarova. The so-called Zengezur corridor would run very close to Armenia and Azerbaijan's borders with Iran. At the same time, Russia, Iran, and Azerbaijan are talking about a separate north-south corridor. Does Ms. Jafarova worry about Azerbaijan becoming a hub for sanctions evasion?
I think the two issues are not really interrelated, because Zengezur corridor is something that is being spoken about in the aftermath of the Second Karabakh War, and that has to connect Azerbaijan, Nakhchivan, Armenia, greater neighborhood. North-south corridor, it has been there for quite some time as the east-west corridor. It's just not really, the name corridor here does not really reflect, any specific organism or body, whatever. It's just a transit route from which the transportation is taking place. What concerns the sanctions evasion, I don't really see the connection, because North-South corridor and East-South corridor, it has been there. The two corridors, so-called corridors, have been there as a matter of transaction between the nations among the two big regions. So I do not think that we have to, speak about these transportation routes in terms of sanctions evasion. And Azerbaijan hasn't really been cited in any way in terms of sanction evasion when it comes to Russian Federation. So I think there is a disconnect in the question there. So the question is no. Answer is no.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Albert Lee of Korea Pro. I think this is for you, Mr. Arduni. The ceasefire that ended the 2020 war resulted in protests in Armenia against Pashinyan's government, but his party, as you pointed out, was able to win the snap elections that followed. How does Armenian society view the moves towards a peace agreement and the exit from the CSTO, and what is the likelihood that they may empower more revanchist elements in Armenian politics?
Thanks for the question, and I think it was Ambassador Heffron that talked about Pashinyan winning re-election at that time. But let me just say a couple things. One, look, Armenia is a fledgling democracy that, there's going to be discourse in the country, just like there's discourse in the United States. And I think that's a great thing for democracy. I think in terms of where the peace process is headed, again, we've said it. We've got concerns for a variety of reasons, including the fact that Azerbaijan is occupying 200 square meters of sovereign Armenia right now. No one seems to talk about that. We're worried about what's in a Declaration of Independence with Soviet times. So I think at the end of the day, look. My point is that if you look at what the Biden administration has talked about, he's talked about defending democracies against autocracies, and that's a pillar of his foreign policy. And Armenia is a textbook example of that. And so you see that there's an opportunity for the U.S. to do so much more, whether it's providing more humanitarian relief, whether it's helping Armenia with security assistance, and also, quite frankly, the imposition of sanctions against Azerbaijan for its human rights abuses. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues still to work through. I appreciate the candor of the conversation and the optimism, and let's keep this conversation going.
Okay, thank you. I think our last question will go to Luke. What could be the specific contributions of partners like, this is an interesting grouping, the US, Turkey, Russia, and France to making peace in the South Caucasus? And this is from Mamadou, forgive me if I mispronounce your last name, Nidaye, who's the Counselor of Foreign Affairs at the Ministry of African Integration and Foreign Affairs in Senegal. Luke?
Firstly, I love it that this issue is getting the attention of our African partners and friends. Look, what the gentleman posed was actually the co-chairs of the Minsk group. So I think for many reasons that is at this point dead in the water. If there's genuine peace between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis, it will be because the Armenians and Azerbaijanis know that their future is best when working together and finding a peaceful resolution to their current issues. We can play a role in the West. Russia will have a role to play, whether we like it or not. Of course it will. France will have a role to play because of its close relationship with Armenia. The United States will have a role to play. Turkey will have a role to play. But we need to enable the two countries to find that platform for peace. We need to encourage it in any way we can. We should probably manage our expectations. We should probably acknowledge the limitations in our own ability to get these two countries to a negotiated, normalized settlement. but that doesn't mean we sit by and do nothing at all. So we each have a role to play, but ultimately peace will be found between these two countries, not come from the outside, but it'll come from within.
Thank you for that. Everyone except you, Ambassador Heffernan, had a chance to say something in response to questions. You have 60 seconds if there's anything you want to add to close us out.
Just again to repeat, I do think the U.S. role is important, and a regional effort to push these countries and neighboring countries to open borders and to open corridors and to trade and invest and to help each other out will make this one of the most prosperous regions in the world, as it should be.
Actually, Ambassador Warlick, I forgot you too. Also, 30 seconds.
No, you didn't forget me. But I would add one more issue to this that needs to be discussed, of course, at another time, and that is the ability for Armenians whose historic home is Nagorno-Karabakh, that they do have the ability to return to their homeland. That's not an easy issue for Azerbaijan, and many Armenians will simply reject that as being too dangerous. But I think a goal in this process, and this has to do with open borders as well, is there should be a right of return for those Armenians, and the government of Azerbaijan should provide security and protection for those who do return.
Okay. Thank you for that. And thanks all of our panelists for a civil and extremely interesting discussion. And thank you to the audience, and we'll be doing more on the South Caucasus in the months to come.
Thank you.